I will never forget. It was about a woman who was deported, separated. She had one child. Her husband was arrested. She had a son, and after the amnesty, they left the deportation settlement. They were in the southern part of the Soviet Union, and her son, I think, got typhus, and he was 6, and he went to the hospital, and she had nothing. She had nothing. So first, I should say that what was especially striking about her testimony was maybe 6 handwritten pages about almost 2 years in Soviet exile, and probably 3/4 of it was about the death of her son. And you could see what was the most important, what affected her the most, that everything else fell away, from the actual experience of being taken from her home to the labor she performed in exile. And it's a very moving, tragic testimony where she describes having to take her son to a Soviet hospital, living on the streets, going to the window to try to look in to see him, begging for food so that she could survive, maybe take something to him. And she writes about, having lice, being dirty, cold. No, actually not cold anymore because she was in the southern part, but having nowhere to live. And she says, and I remember her words, I would gladly have lived like that much longer if my son had only survived, but he didn't. And she found out that her son had died because she went to the hospital to try to visit him and saw that his name was crossed off the list. And that's how she knew her son. And then she tried, she buried him, and she talked about the fact that, she couldn't leave a real marker that her son was in Soviet territory. And she wrote that after a month or two, she got a fair, for the time, a sum of money. Her husband had reached the Polish army and sent her some money. And, she wrote, like, what am I going to do with this money? She said, I can't even erect a tombstone to my only son because they don't have any materials here. And from the beginning, it was a shock for the women, because why were they being deported? They were just women. They were just living at home. They weren't in the army. They weren't in the government. They weren't local leaders. And so first of all, that shock of why are you taking, and they say in their testimonies, we're only women. We're just women. How could we be dangerous? So there's that shock. Then there was the shock of the conditions on the transports where not only were they inhuman, but there was a double strike against them as females because for them it was extremely offensive and shameful that they were in intimate spaces with people of both genders, that they had to relieve themselves in front of other people through holes in the floor, or they had to get out of the train car and squat on the ground. And again, there's just already that just human humiliation of having to do that in front of people. But particularly as women, they felt, they felt the need, more than men to, cover and shield their bodies. And it was extremely painful and shameful for them. Then there was the issue once they were at whatever settlement they were taken to. How do you set up a home for your children? Which they had to often do by themselves because they didn't have a husband or a father to help with that. And then the issue of labor, which was extremely difficult for their women. Again, in part, just it was difficult for a human being to do the kinds of labor that the Soviets were forcing them to do, because it was, as a rule, heavy manual labor with extremely high norms or quotas for daily output in the worst possible circumstances, be it in terms of weather or lack of proper clothing, lack of tools. And so for any person, male or female, this was very difficult labor. It was extremely difficult for Polish women because they express over and over again that this kind of labor was not proper for them as women. And they felt it very much as unnatural that they were being asked to do this. And in fact, they found it extremely, on the one hand, surprising, but in a different way, sort of confirmation of their opinions of Russians, that Russian women were doing that labor, maybe not extremely successfully, but with little complaint. They were kind of used to it. And so for Polish women, they thought, well, this is outrageous. How this is not labor for women. This is an abnormal society for asking women to do this. But it also sort of confirmed their opinion of Soviets, particularly Russians, as unnatural, not Western, because they had the sense, well, their women can do that kind of labor. It's not natural, and they really understood that as it's not civilized. For people outside of Poland, and for a while also inside Poland, the whole question of the civilian deportations to the Soviet Union were a blank spot. I mean, you know perfectly well that in the communist period, it couldn't be talked about even in Poland, especially in Poland. But outside of Poland, if people knew anything about the Soviet invasion and annexation, they knew about the soldiers murdered at Katyn. And I myself was surprised when I learned that that was a tremendously tragic experience, but the numbers of people involved were only a fraction of the numbers of people who were taken by the Soviets into the Soviet Union. So for me, first of all, the whole question of who knows, especially in the US or Western Europe, what the Soviets did to the civilian population. And secondly, I've been studying women in war in Eastern Europe for 25 years now. And still, I think it's changing now because of what we see around us. And we're so much more aware of how societies are brought into war. But for so long, it was just assumed women were at home. If anything happened to women, they were on the sidelines, and it was incidental, and it wasn't an important part of the war. But I think any modern war that you look at, women were as involved as men, particularly in the 20th century, because the targets of the occupiers and conquerors was, to some extent, either transform society, destroy the society that existed, destroy its culture, and by necessity, women had to be involved in that enterprise and become targets. And it's taken, I think, broader society many, many decades to have that lesson learned, even though it's been there, but no one was interested. So that's the second part of it, being a blank spot. And then I think the third part is that it's very difficult for societies to talk about some aspects of the treatment and experiences of women during war or in exile, either because it's so traumatic and people don't want to hear about it, they don't want to deal with it, or because some of it might go against expectations of proper ideal behavior, and so it's easier for a society to just be quiet about it